Hey out there, Internet. This is Pastor Becky. I am coming to you again from my basement as we prepare to have worship at home when we cannot gather together in person. I hope that you are all doing well, that you are safe and feeling healthy, that you are able to stay at home as much as possible and um, avoid too much contact so that we can all keep one another safe. But I wanted to let you know, especially people from Christ the Victor, that I miss you and I'm really looking forward to whenever this is over and we can get back together. Um, and it's good to chat with you and text with you and hear from you. So if I haven't been in touch with you lately, don't hesitate to give me a holler or email. And it'd be great to catch up since we can't see each other on Sunday or other times during the week. Today is the fifth Sunday in Lent. And our gospel reading is from Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. And then we skip a little bit and we pick it back up at verse 24 and read through till verse 37. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his slaves in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to you all, keep awake. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. This is one of those gospels where I end and I'm not so sure that we give a resounding, the gospel of the Lord. It made me think, well, honestly, the past several weeks have had the chorus of a song from Hamilton running through my mind. It's from the Battle of Yorktown song. If you don't know Hamilton, that's okay. But it is kind of near the middle of the play, and it describes the Battle of Yorktown, which is the final battle between the British and the American Revolutionary soldiers. And it is when the British forces surrender. And Hamilton, the character, says, "And as our fallen foes retreat, I hear the drinking song they're singing," talking about the British. And they're singing, "The world turned upside down, The world turned upside down. And then the whole chorus, all of the people in the play start to sing, the world turned upside down, the world turned upside down. And for the Americans, that's a great thing because they have toppled this amazing power. But for the British who are singing the song, it is this complete reversal and the opposite of what they would have expected going into this war. And so, um, just that line, the world turned upside down, has just been reverberating in my brain for the past few weeks. And I'm sure similar thoughts have been in yours as well. This is our third week of not gathering in person for church, for worship. I'm not sure. I don't really remember. I remember when school was officially closed. I'm not sure. I think the same day or shortly thereafter, the request for us to socially isolate and physically distance ourselves from each other happened. And then this past week in Wisconsin was the safer at home order from the governor, closing non essential businesses and bars and restaurants and nail salons and hair places and all of that stuff, asking everybody who can work from home to work from home, and anyone who wasn't doing some sort of essential job to stay home as much as they possibly could, unless it was for, doctor's appointment or medicine pickup or groceries, but really to kind of self isolate as much as we can. Um, and while we self isolate, we sit around and we listen and read these news articles, stories about COVID 19 climbing just exponentially, um, in our communities and our state and around the world. And even though we heard about it when it was happening in China, and we heard about it spreading in South Korea and Italy and other countries, like somehow it still kind of took us by surprise that it might happen here, that it would become this just scary thing that is just growing and growing by leaps and bounds. Um, I think about our last council meeting as a church was on March 10th, which was a Tuesday. And at that point, we said we will, not uh, pass the peace by shaking hands, and we will, refrain from hugging, and I wouldn't shake hands when we left. And we encourage everybody to use hand sanitizer, and the offering plate would not be passed. It would just be placed for people to put their offering in it. So that was our plan on Tuesday. And by Friday, the 13th, um, all of that had changed, and we decided it was best to just not gather in person at all, starting that weekend, just because of the risk to so many and to our community. Um, and the world turned upside down. The change that our world has been experiencing on this scale is just unprecedented in our lifetime, right? Like everybody knows or thinks that something bad or traumatic or sad could happen in their life because that's a normal part of life. But we never really saw this pandemic coming that is just ravaging world populations, and it has caused our economy to come to a sudden screeching halt. Um, so there is that economic distress and worry for people. There we have fear um, for our health and for our loved ones' health, if they are, or if we are, healthcare professionals or others who have essential jobs that require you to go to work and potentially expose yourself. Whenever I go to the grocery store, I think about the people that are working there who see everybody who comes through the door. Um, and we live with just that not knowing. Um, and as on a slightly lighter note, I laugh because here I am recording, and every pastor I know, most of them, never in history have so many pastors and teachers and probably doctors and other professions had to suddenly ramp up their knowledge about technology, and figure out how to use these things that maybe we knew existed, um, but didn't know how to use and never really bothered to really like learn well because they didn't seem urgently necessary. And so all of a sudden, here we are. Um, but, up until a few weeks ago, I think most of us just assumed life would pretty well continue on, um, at least at a societal community level, at the way that it always has. We don't tend to give much thought to these things, but we just kind of trust that the things we've always had and relied on would probably be there for us. And what a shock for things to turn in this direction. And we see that, I think, in this gospel lesson that I read to you today. Um, Scholars call it Mark's little apocalypse. An apocalypse is a word that means unveiling or revelation. It is not just, some scary story about the end of the world, even though it kind of reads to us that way. We pick up the story right where we left off last week with Jesus, who had been in the temple, now leaving the temple with his disciples. And one of his disciples, looks around at the building and is like, "Wow, Jesus, do you see this building?" Like you must have seen it on the way in, but um, look at how big the stones are. This is just an amazing building. And, um, this magnitude and immensity and glory is just all around them. And something that big, really, you feel like is going to last forever because it'd be hard to knock it down. Um, and even more than that, this building, this place symbolized for them God's presence among God's people. Like that's where you go to encounter God and to offer sacrifice, to hear words of forgiveness. Um, like that just has this centrality in the life of that people and that community of faith. And what a shock and a surprise it must have been when Jesus says, "Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. This whole thing's going to go away." Um, like, ah! Um, Everything that they had placed so much trust in, not just the building, but the whole system that revolved around the centrality of that building, is going to be destroyed, Jesus. And in Mark's time, it actually was. The temple was destroyed about 70 AD. Um, but that is a world turning upside down kind of situation. And then, of course, Jesus goes on and makes it sound even worse. There's this disturbing scenario of wars and rumors of wars and kingdoms rising against kingdoms and earthquakes and famines and like, okay, Jesus. And then if that's not enough, wait, there's more. We skip some verses where he talks about being called before the authorities and family betraying family and how they need to flee the ruling powers. But that's not even all. We come back into it and Jesus talks about the sun being dark and the moon not giving light and the stars falling from the heaven. And we're like, holy moly, Jesus. Um, and Jesus says, "So beware, be alert, keep alert, for you don't know when all of this will happen. It is like a man going on a journey who leaves his slaves in charge, each with their work to do, and you don't know when he's coming back. It could be at night or midnight or cockcrow or dawn, and, stay awake so that you're awake when he returns." And we think, having read all of this and with all of the stuff that is on our minds, we're like, who can sleep, Jesus? If I fall asleep, maybe I'm going to have bad dreams. So, um, and I was listening to a podcaster this past week who was, she and another person do a podcast on the upcoming gospel reading. And she said she had woken up early. She couldn't sleep. She was stressed by all of this stuff going on. And she decided she would do a little work on, preparing for the podcast. And she opens up the gospel, hoping for some solace and some hope. And this is what she found. Not It doesn't feel like the most hopeful of readings, right? Like it sounds like the end of the world. And yet, apocalyptic literature is actually intended to bring comfort to people who are living through tumultuous and anxiety provoking times. As scary as these images are to us and probably to them back then, um, there is hope and comfort in these words. And I do find hope in these words in a couple of places, but especially at the end of verse 8, where Jesus says, "This is but the beginning of the birth pangs," which, doesn't sound super great. Um, but a couple thoughts on that. First of all, it's hard to fall asleep while you're giving birth, for one thing. um, And I think as we go through this situation that we're in right now, pandemic and economic strife and uncertainty, as awful as they are a wake-up call to us. Um, because in the case of America anyway, these things happening help us to notice and recognize all of the people around us who we take for granted in our day-to-day lives that make our way of life possible, right? The childcare workers, the teachers, the garbage collectors, the grocery store stockers, the cashiers, the truck drivers, the people who work for what they call the gig economy, the Lyft drivers, the Uber drivers, the Instacart shoppers, the Amazon warehouse employees, the restaurant workers, like all the custodians in the hospitals, all of these things. Um, they kind of go on behind the scenes and we don't pay attention to them, and our society is not tended to pay them well or give them benefits. Um, and all of a sudden we're seeing what that does when we have a crisis of this kind. And it also wakes us up to the long-standing problems with our healthcare system, with affordability and with access to healthcare. Um, we knew those problems existed, but we could kind of ignore them, right? Like until we start to see the ways that how that affects the people who don't have healthcare can influence the whole rest of society and our lives, like we're just kind of can turn a blind eye to it. Um, and so there is a wake up in this situation. And when Jesus says, it's just the beginning of the birth pangs, part of us is like, that means it's going to get worse. What does that mean, Jesus? And, the reality is when you're in giving birth, it does get more intense. It gets more painful. Birth, the experience of birth is a life-changing process. Labor and delivery is exhausting and it's painful and it causes you to draw on strength that you did not know that you had. It can be drawn out and filled with complications and worry. And yet all of that comes with a purpose, right? Like we get excited about someone who's nearing their due date and the expectation and the longing for that baby to come into the world, to have that new life and all of that possibility and all of that love that we want to pour out to that person, like makes all of the hardship of birth really worth it. And so I wonder, what is God longing to give birth to in this situation of this pandemic? Now, don't get me wrong, because I am not not remotely suggesting that God sent this virus or designed it to teach us a lesson or anything. That is not my theology. But my theology is that God is able to bring good out of even the worst kinds of situations, that God can use this situation, this waking up, can use us as God's people to give birth to something new, to create something different in our society out of this. Um, I saw a meme a lot this weekend, which is, just the pretty picture, usually with a quote or something on it. But the quote was, "In the rush to return to normal, use this time to consider which parts of normal are worth rushing back to." In the rush to return to normal, use this time to consider which parts of normal are worth rushing back to. What is it? As we sit in our houses and hopefully get outside for some fresh air and exercise and, maybe clean the house or catch up on hobbies or continue to work or do, take care of kids, whatever it is, when we have those moments to think, what is it that we value and what is it that we think needs to change? Not just in our personal lives, but in the world around us. When this is all over, how do we keep alert to the things that we are learning in this time? How do we stay awake rather than falling back into the lethargy that so often just kind of like sucks us back into hanging out on the couch instead of paying attention to the problems in the world that God would like us to be a part of solving, right? How do we partner with God in the work of giving birth to this kingdom that Jesus inaugurated, right? So that God's kingdom is here on earth as it is in heaven, so that the hungry are fed and the sick are taken care of and the naked are clothed and the prisoner is visited and the homeless has a place to live. Like those are signs of God's kingdom coming, and not just dealing with like those specific needs, um, but dismantling the systems that allow those problems to exist, that contribute to them, that lead to their existence in the first place. How do we be a part of real structural change in this world to bring about the values of God that we are called to be about giving birth to? Now, for the disciples in the story, in the timeline of this story, they're very close to their world being turned upside down. This is not just an end time thing for them. Jesus is soon to call them together for their final meal, and they will go out to pray with him, and they will scatter in terror when the guards come to arrest him and take him away. Peter will deny Jesus 3 times before the cock crows, right? And Jesus will be brought to Pilate at dawn and condemned to death on the cross. And after he dies, he will be laid in a stone-sealed tomb. And that would seem to be the end of the story, right? But we know what the disciples don't yet know, that this tomb of death will give birth to new life, to resurrection, to hope that was unimaginable on Good Friday and is this unbelievable joy on Easter Sunday morning. We know that sadness and grief and fear do not last forever because Jesus has conquered all of those things. He has replaced them with his love and with peace and with hope and with courage. That is the world turned upside down indeed. Or rather, that is Jesus turning the world finally right side up and calling us, as always, to be about the work of this kingdom that he is bringing to birth from his birth until now, so that we can be part of that kingdom and working in that kingdom to draw others into it, until at last Jesus comes again in glory to gather us all together. And what a great and glorious day that will be. And for that we say, thanks be to God. Amen.